Okay. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Real Crusades History live stream. I'm J. Stephen Roberts, and I'm here with my good friend Helena Schrader. She's here to join us for coffee and the Crusades. So, Helena, how are you doing today?
Hot. It's still really hot in Greece.
Yeah, it is hot
But
here too. Yeah, it's that time of year.
it's summer.
Um,
Yeah.
But yeah, guys, this is the Q&A for Real Crusades History, where we just discuss medieval history. And I'm glad to be here with you guys. As some of you may have noticed, this is kind of going to be the last show for a while, just because I'm kind of trying to streamline my time. But I think at some point, Helena and Rand and all of us, we will work on doing some future live streams and coming up with some times to discuss the Crusades and discuss medieval history in a live format, because I do love the live format. So I'm glad you guys are here with us to kind of do this final sort of regular Tuesday stream that we've always been doing. So anyway, Helena, it's good to have you here. So aside from being hot in Greece, what else have you been up to lately?
Well, I'm actually heading out back to the States from Greece tomorrow. So mostly I've been focused largely on getting ready to leave with all the kinds of daily tasks. So I haven't really been focused on the Crusades. I'm sorry. So maybe I hope we'll have some good questions that'll stimulate some discussion.
Well, that's good to hear. Well, safe travels to you as you're heading out. I know that's a long flight. I've done the flight. Yeah, the flight across.
2 days. It takes me a day to get from my island just to Athens, and from Athens we're going via Munich to Boston.
Yeah, for sure. The flight across the proverbial pond is always it's always quite an experience. So, but yeah, guys, let's see. I'm going to look through here. I think you guys already have some questions going on. Anything you guys want to ask, feel free to. Let's see here. This is actually an interesting one from Jonah Vernon, who asks, how safe was it to go on pilgrimage in the Holy Land after the Third Crusade? Did the knightly orders continue to escort pilgrims to Jerusalem? So that is a good question. Helena, do you want to go first on that, or should I?
Well, it has to be broken up. The pilgrimage to the Holy Land itself was not that dangerous, because the Mediterranean was still controlled by basically the Italian fleet. And of course the Sicilian fleet, but the Eastern Mediterranean, not until the Ottoman Empire was the Mediterranean really that dangerous. There were pirates. I'm not going to say it was like safe traveling today, but it was comparatively safe. It was probably no worse than traveling to Ireland. I don't know. But going to Jerusalem, in other words, leaving the Crusader States on the coast and taking the trip into Jerusalem was quite fraught and very dangerous. Maybe you have an answer on that. My understanding is that the pilgrims were not allowed to be escorted, that the militant orders were not allowed to escort the pilgrims into Jerusalem under the Ayyubids, that they had to basically give themselves over to had to turn themselves over to Muslim guards and trust the Muslim Mamluks or the Muslim authorities to get to protect their safety, which was not actually all that intelligent. There was a lot of instances of pilgrims being hurt, captured, wounded, killed, taken as slaves. And it was so dangerous that the Catholic Church actually tried to provide alternative holy places in Accra, so that you could still get your absolution from sin, not by going to Jerusalem, but by visiting X site in Accra or Y site in someplace still controlled by the Christians. I don't know if you have something to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually just thinking that I'm not too sure on that myself. The only reference I have that immediately comes to mind is I don't know if you've ever read that really interesting book by Marjorie Kemp from the 14th century. So this was a lot later.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great book. It's written by an English woman who traveled to the Holy Land in the 14th century. And she does talk about how, she had to hire Turkish escorts to take her to the Holy Land. Of course, this was after the Kingdom of Jerusalem was gone. So, but yeah, that's an interesting question, Jonah. I would need to look that up and confirm whether or not how pilgrims traveled to Jerusalem itself while it was under Muslim control after the Third Crusade. I think Helena's going to look it up for us right now. So
I
that's
was looking
awesome.
there was this, I know I had, as I said, during the Second Kingdom of Jerusalem, during the Acre Kingdom, that they did, as I say, try to religious tourism. I'm trying to see if I could say, yeah, so in good years it was 60,000.
And while you're looking that up, Helena, I
Okay,
will.
yeah.
Oh, she's got it. Okay.
No, go ahead, please go ahead with
Okay.
other things.
I was going to say
didn't
I'd check and see what everybody else is saying, and then if you do find that, we can jump.
Yep, absolutely.
This is a fun one. This is from Akaviri. If the Knights Templar fought against the Japanese warrior monks, who do you think would win and why? I will be honest, I have no idea because I don't really know anything about Japanese history. I wish I knew more. I would like to look more into medieval Japan, but yeah, that's kind of a fun question, though. At first, I thought you were going to say the samurai, but I guess maybe that's different from warrior monks. But let's see here. And Jonathan Phelps says, "Glad to be a part of the last one of the year." Well, you never know. Maybe we'll do another one at some point later as the year goes by. Let's see here. And Bleak says Helena rocks, and yes, I agree.
Thank you. But I'm not finding what I wanted, which was, as I say,
okay.
that during the second.
It's that determination that's part of what makes you effective, Helena. So let's see. And then Jonathan asks, did the Hospitaller Order grow knowledge of medicine and even know how to perform surgeries?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yes. I was going to say, I do remember reading some of that in that book you recommended to me years ago about medicine in the Crusader States. I can't remember the author's name. But
it's Mitchell, Piers Mitchell. Let me pull it out and show it to people.
That is a really good book.
Can anybody see this? Medicine
Yes.
in the Era of the Crusades. It is brilliant. The author is, and I can even say that I can't even pronounce it, but an expert in looking at bones and looking at and doing, and what is it called? Osteoarchaeologist. And he really did an extensive study of the medical techniques used in the crusading era, and also what was like, he's got tables of what they fed and what the food was, the diet was in the hospitals, etc. Surgery actually was quite advanced on both, and the surgery techniques were very similar on both sides. It's not true that the Arabs were wildly more sophisticated in the surgery. They were capable of doing cataract operations, brain surgery. They have evidence of people surviving, major brain injuries and obviously fighting again, living to fight another day. You can tell that by the bones because they heal and then they go on and they get killed at a later stage. They, of course, they had very, very sophisticated surgery techniques. Some of the things they had, the Arabs admired. Some of the things they didn't. There were some differences, but both the Arab world, the Byzantine world, all three, and the Latin Christian world basically based their ideas of medicine on ancient Greek texts. They all had the same traditions, and they had all translated them and were using them. And the Crusader kingdoms became a major interface between medical professionals, particularly the city of Antioch had a major medical library and an area where texts from in a variety of different languages were maintained and then translated from one language into the other. The area in which the Muslims were particularly advanced was actually in medical care more than directly in surgery. The Byzantines had the Latin Christians prior to the First Crusade were still basically living in a kind of hospice environment where people who were sick either were taken care of at home if you were wealthy, or you went to a barber or an apothecary and got ad hoc help. And the religious orders had infirmaries, but they were manned by monks and nuns, not by trained medical professionals. And then, so there was no such thing really as hospitals in which trained medical professionals specialized in trying to heal the sick. People went to hospices to die. They went to, if they were in the infirmary, they went there to actually, they were getting more spiritual help than maybe medical help. There was learning on the job. There were people who had, the infirmaries learned a lot about pharmaceuticals and healing, but it's somewhat different. As I say, the Byzantine tradition was they had trained medical professionals who worked in hospitals part-time. So they worked in hospitals. This is very important. Were always for the poor. The rich would be taken care of by trained medical professionals that they paid in their homes. But if somebody could not afford a trained medical professional, they could go to a hospital in the Byzantine Empire and get medical treatment there by the same people who treated the rich, but now offering their services for free as part of a charity. The Arabs took that one step farther. The Byzantine hospitals tended to be small and local. The Arabs went one step farther. They actually had state hospitals. It became a prestige, what do you call it, an object of prestige for a sultan or for an emir, anyone with power, to found a hospital. And they had 1,000-bed hospitals, and they built huge institutions that were also teaching hospitals, where there were libraries, where they were training professionals. They were started to provide segregation by illness. So you didn't just dump everybody who was sick in the same room. If they had an infectious disease, they would actually be segregated apart. And so that the Arabs made huge advances in medical practice, in medical, as I say, in how they delivered medicine, shall we say. But when you look, what Piers Mitchell proves is that if you look at the techniques in terms of how did they treat a broken arm, or how did they deal with an arrow wound or an abscess, it was actually quite similar across all cultures.
All right. So good answer there from Helena. And Alexander says, why were there many Crusader states in Levant, not just one? I'd like to know why the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the County of Tripoli were separate, for example. So yeah, that's an interesting question. I've actually heard people pose that question before. Like, would it have not made more sense to just have it all be one big political entity? I think a lot of that had to do with the way the states were founded, and also just the nature of power at this time. I mean, they were all founded by specific groups, or even founded around the leadership of a particular individual who represented one of those groups, like the South Italian Normans who founded Antioch under Bohemond, and the Lotharingians who, kind of got established in Jerusalem. Tripoli was founded by, the Count of Toulouse and the grouping around him. And so that's kind of how those political entities evolved. But they did function as a cohesive whole to a certain extent in terms of their ability to defend themselves, though. Like, that's one of the remarkable things about the Crusader states. Is the king of Jerusalem did have kind of a seniority just because of his rank as a king. And there was some resistance to that at some times by the counts of Tripoli and, some of these rulers in the other Crusader states. But there was a lot more cohesiveness and cooperation, I think, than is often given credit for. What do you think, Helena?
Well, in the important moments, they did all stand together. And one could actually argue that maybe the King of Jerusalem should have spent less time trying to save Antioch and let it go. And had he done that, maybe Jerusalem would have been stronger. I mean, you can argue both sides. But the fact that they were different entities, as you say, was simply a historical accident. That's how they evolved. But the Count of Tripoli was almost always supporting the King of Jerusalem. I don't know of any instance where they were opposed to one another, or where the Knights of Tripoli did not, support a call for the defense of Jerusalem. With Antioch, that was not necessarily true, but that was simply because their own border was so vulnerable. So that the Knights of Antioch were almost always totally engaged in defending their own borders. And the same way, Jerusalem, as I say, sometimes had to send support to Antioch, which weakened the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Notoriously, actually, the battle of amongst Gisard, when Saladin invaded, was in part because the Hospitallers and many of the Knights of Jerusalem had gone north to fight in Antioch, and actually an offensive with the Count. of Flanders. It was quite unnecessary that they went north, but they had gone north, weakening the kingdom of Jerusalem. Ultimately, it didn't make that much difference because King Baldwin IV, of course, still managed to defeat Saladin at Montgisard with the troops he had.
All right. Let's see here. So Jonathan Phelps wants to know what kind of medicines did the Hospitallers use? Wait a minute, did we already get that one? I think we already got that question.
Well, it's a little bit different. I mean, the medicines, that's one of the things that was that the Crusader states had access to some of the most important sources of medieval medicine, opiates, particularly opium itself, etc. No, I mean, incredibly
Some
important.
Things don't change.
No, I mean, let's not fool ourselves. Morphine is based on opium. I mean, it is a painkiller, and it was incredibly important for them to be able to do. It's wrong to think that they carried out these operations without any anesthetics. They had very good anesthetics, very powerful natural anesthetics. They were normally a mixture of these natural things, and many of the drugs used in medieval medicine and necessary for medieval medicine were sourced in India or the Arab, or Africa, and came through the Levant, so that basically the pharmaceuticals in the Levant were cheaper than the same pharmaceuticals were cheaper in the Levant than they were in Western Europe. And they did have very sophisticated, that's one of the things Mitchell points out, very, very sophisticated drugs based on, he said, things that we can replicate them today, and they're very powerful. It may be easier for us to make something chemically, rather than using natural sources. It may be cheaper for us and more convenient, but it doesn't mean that what they had then was ineffective.
Absolutely. And let's see here. So Bleak says, and it's good to see you here, Bleak. You're a long time. You've been with us for a long time, so we appreciate that. Asks, how often were mercenaries used in Outremer, and what types of troops were commonly used in this role? They were used quite often. They could be Westerners from, kind of Latin Europe. They could be Eastern Christians. They could even be Turkish Muslims. I know there was an Tancred, when he was in Antioch, there's a description of some Turks who were rebelling against another local Turk, and his son came out to Tancred, and he had some Turks with him, and they became mercenaries in Tancred's service. So that could happen. It could be just about any kind of troop. And I would say they probably were used more frequently as time went on, especially after, we get into the Second Kingdom, and as the Templars and Hospitallers become more important to the defense of the castles of the Crusader states, as the Mamluks start to put pressure on them. One of the major things that the Templars and Hospitallers did was hire mercenaries to, staff the defense of the Crusader states. So, yeah, that's
I don't have much to add to that. The thing is, it's hard to define where are the Hospitallers and Templars, are they themselves mercenaries? Are they, how do you define mercenary? I wouldn't do that. I'm not saying
they weren't themselves mercenaries, but they would hire mercenaries.
They did. Yes, they hired, and they said, but almost any in the medieval period, you had your vassals who owed a military service, but any lord, and particularly Rand would love saying, if we go back to 100 Years' War, or we go look at the Wars of the Roses, any feudal lord will also have an entourage and a household, and those household are being paid a service, they're being paid a fee, and they're serving with their sword. Are those mercenaries? What I'm saying is, there's not that clear a line in medieval society between, right. And yet, obviously, the mercenary companies that were notorious in the 100 Years' War were, they would change sides at the drop of a hat, and that's sort of your classic mercenary. So they certainly did. They did exist in the medieval time, but I'm saying that the transition, there's the borderline between mercenary and troop is much fuzzier and less defined in the medieval period.
Absolutely. So this is kind of interesting. Taco Cruiser, I feel like you've asked this question before, or somebody has. This may be our most popular question we get.
Yeah, I think we've had this before. Yeah.
Yeah, how could would the Third Crusade have been different if Frederick Barbarossa had not died? And the question is, would Richard and Frederick have gotten into some kind of fight over who was going to push around who? And I have just always felt that this is just would not have been an issue at all. I think they would have just cooperated. And I think that everything about their careers up until this point points to that. When we talk about people being, these medieval rulers being proud men, that is true, but they also had this really sharp sense of, kind of respecting the status of noblemen. And I think that Richard and Frederick would have respected each other. I think Richard and Philip both showed respect for each other while they were actually crusading in the Holy Land. I mean, I think there was a lot of animosity between them, but the truth is they really did cooperate mostly effectively for the brief time they were working together. I think we would have seen that even more so between Frederick and Richard. They were both capable generals. They both, and I think that the thing I think I mentioned last time we talked about this was, I think the most crucial thing is that they were both true believers. These were both men who were committed to this crusade, and I think that they would have cooperated together effectively because of that.
I agree, and I think they probably would have found, as you say, they would have rapidly found a way to who has a strength in what, and maybe divided up things, and they wouldn't have tried to occupy the same place in the sun. They would have rapidly said, okay, if we have enough troops, because if we're saying if Frederick hadn't died, his entire crusading armor, well, not his entire crusading armor, but the bulk of his crusading army would have been with him. That means there would have been many more troops. That means they might have been able to have double-pronged attacks. They might have been able to go for Beirut and go maybe, I don't know, and go for Cairo at the same time, or they could have had diversionary moves, etc. And I just think that, as you say, they would have found a way, but ultimately it would have depended a lot on the chemistry of the two men and how they got along. And we can't know that. But there's no inherent reason why they could not have cooperated.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Okay, so as we're getting into our last minutes here, I'm going to try to pick some people who haven't gotten to ask a question yet. And I think this is Scott. Is this you, Scott? I think that's your profile there, but that looks like your cat. So at the time of the First Crusade, was the Hospital of St. John located outside of the city walls? I believe the answer to that is no. Isn't that correct, Helena?
Yeah, that's what I understand.
Yeah,
it was inside Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of reminds me of the fact that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not all contained within a single building when the First Crusaders got there, because a lot of the exterior had been destroyed, but the city itself was enclosed in a substantial, defensive wall at the time of the First Crusade. Obviously,
and just a minute, there was no Hospital of St. John.
Right.
Just to be absolutely clear, the roots of the Hospitallers, the Order of St. John, is founded based on a hospital. The roots are a hospital that existed in Jerusalem before the First Crusade, that had been established by Italians that were in residence there and provided basically hospice care, not real medical treatment, for many pilgrims who arrived in a very poor state and without means. But it was not at that time the Hospital of St. John. It is not until after the First Crusades that the order is actually formed.
Yeah, that's a really good point. What was it called at that time, Helena? Do you remember? Or was it even...
There was the hospital. Let's see what my hospitaller source is. Talk with the others.
Okay. It's funny. I was just reading about this morning in William of Tyre, and he was talking about kind of some of the early history of the hospital in Jerusalem. And one of the things he mentioned is the two founders, sort of semi-mythical figures.
Well, St. Gerard is
right,
called.
St. Gerard.
Gerard.
And then
Gerard
also,
Gerald. Okay,
Hmm.
so
And then also a woman named Agnes. There was like a female figure who tended to widows and to women pilgrims, and she had some sisters working with her. Her name was Agnes. At least that's the name that William of Tyre
yeah,
gives us. So
yeah.
pretty interesting. It's pretty fascinating to think about. That hospital operating over all that time up until the arrival of the First Crusade, and that does seem to be what happened. So.
No, this doesn't seem to.
So we will here's somebody else who hasn't gotten a chance to ask something yet. And if Helena wants to look for that, we will give her a chance to do that. And Ad Astra says, do you think the Crusades would have continued and eventually permanently won Jerusalem for the Christians if awful Philip of France didn't betray the Templars and cause the end of the order as it was? That's a pretty big question. Of course, you're talking about Philip IV of France. I don't know if the destruction of the Templars was necessarily the decisive thing that prevented Latin Christendom from ever really getting control of the Holy Land again. I think that had more to do with the increasing, and this does kind of like point back to Philip of France, but the increasing predominance of and power really of the monarchs of Latin Europe, and kind of the lessening influence and power of the church. Conversely to that. Excuse me.
No.
But what I was saying is that as kind of the church kind of like was sort of at its pinnacle in terms of its power and influence in the age of the Crusades, and the church was constantly pressing for focus on the Crusades. And a thing that starts to happen in the late Middle Ages is a lot of the monarchies kind of consolidate power, become more centralized in their power. France, of course, is the classic example. France emerges as the great power, on kind of the late medieval world stage in the Latin West, and even was able to pretty much bully the Pope. Kind of a stark, a stark change from the days when Innocent III could kind of, act as the overlord almost of all these different kings. So yeah, I think that had more to do with why, and the reason I say that is because the rulers of Europe were less inclined to kind of take the call to crusade as seriously as they had been in the past. They were more concerned with their own competition, their own power politics. Like, for example, this like increasingly absorbing war between England and France, which kind of coincides with the increasing power of the King of France. So, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, Helena?
I don't think that it would have been possible to retake Jerusalem from the West in the from after it was lost. The only way the Crusader States could have survived is if they had been able to hold on to the territory, or as I say, even take Jerusalem. There were a number of ways that the Crusader States could, in the 13th century, could have survived. They could have, and of course, one of my favorite ones is what if stories is if Richard the Lionheart had been willing to take the crown of Jerusalem and marry the heiress and stay, then he probably would have been able to capture Jerusalem, and then if they would have had to be able to solidify their position. But even in 1244, they had actually regained Jerusalem, and if they hadn't allied with the wrong Ayyubid, possibly they could have held on, reestablished the kingdom. There were a number of opportunities for it to regain strength, but once it was lost, what J. Stephen is rightly pointing out to, there was not the same kind of commitment on the part of Western Christendom to return, and they were too busy with other issues and other fronts.
Yeah. And with that, let's go ahead and take our last question, which is from Welsh Muslim Dave, and he actually says, "Assalamu alaikum." So, and same to you. Because of the movie Kingdom of Heaven, I know how to pronounce that. So Welsh Muslim Dave asks, could the First Crusade have occurred at a much earlier time than it did? And if so, how much earlier could it have happened? I'll give my take on that. I think no. I think no, because Latin Christendom did not yet have the economic power and military power to make a trans, continental crusade happen. Like say, like in the days of Charlemagne, I don't think it would have been possible. But and also Sicily hadn't been reconquered yet. Really, securing Italy, which meant which mainly was dependent on securing Sicily, which happened shortly before the First Crusade. Once that was achieved by the Normans, that was a pretty big game changer. It meant that Latin Christendom could kind of dominate the Mediterranean, or at least challenge the Muslim states on the Mediterranean, as they had not been able to do before. But do you have some thoughts on that one, Helena?
No, I entirely agree with you that the Western Crusades wouldn't have been possible earlier because of the poverty, and as you say, they were basically in a defensive mode. It took a while to gain the strength and the ability and the shipping and everything that went along with it. I think Sicily, as you say, is critical, but also the restoration of Crete. What I was looking for was the dates when the Byzantium came close to recapturing Jerusalem, because we should remember that it's not just the Western Christians. The Byzantines also came very close once.
Yeah, Basil II, right?
They retook Cyprus.
Oh yeah, that was Basil II. That was what's his name? The Pale Death of the Saracens was his moniker. I can't remember what that emperor's name was, or if he was he the emperor, or was he a general? I think he was Basil II's godfather or something.
I don't think but as I say,
John the First, maybe.
Again, if they had not had more internal problems, which basically then weakened the empire, and they end up then retreating again, there were periods when they came very close to retaking Jerusalem.
Nicephorus II, yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. Pale Death of the Saracens was his title, which I've always thought that's a classic.
Very, very poetic. Yeah.
Yeah, it is poetic. I think was he fair complected? Was that why he had that name, or was there something else? Some other reason? I'd have to look into that. But that's a great time in Byzantine history. That sort of last hurrah they had with that series of emperors leading up to Basil II. Pretty interesting. And the thing about that is, probably if it hadn't been for the rise of the Turks, I think there's a good chance that the Byzantines would have been able to overtake the Arabs, because Arab power really did kind of collapse, and they weren't able to. The style of fighting that they engaged in was not really as effective.
It was the Seljuk. It was this young, vigorous the Turkomans coming in that revived Islam in the Levant.
Yeah. So
and then the Ottomans, obviously, again. Yes. The Mamluks also, it's one after another, and then the Ottomans came and invigorated the area again, Islam in the region.
Yeah, the Turks play such a huge role, the 11th century on. So, but yeah, it's interesting too. The 11th century was such a breakthrough moment for the Latin West. The increasing population, the increasing wealth, the Italians kind of coming into their own as these great maritime powers. I mean, that is just a revolutionary and fascinating period.
And of course, what I've been working on the book that'll come out next year about women. It was the 12th century was also the pinnacle of basically women's rights until practically you get back to the 20th century. The 12th and early 13th century was an age when women were very influential, very powerful in professions and in the economy and as rulers, etc. And it's an interesting period. It really is a flourishing. What do they call it? The medieval Renaissance. But I actually think it's more exciting than the so-called Renaissance, which in many ways was backwards, was backsliding, at least for women.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the successes and the achievements of the late Middle Ages and the early modern era really are rooted in that period. I mean, this was such a the High Middle Ages was such a crucial developmental stage for kind of making the Latin West into a thing in itself. So I think, I definitely agree that, I mean, that period is, horribly overlooked, especially, I mean, all the great achievements in art and everything, of course, in the Renaissance. I mean, all that does really have its roots in breakthroughs
In
that
the
were being
Crusader
made.
States, in the
Yeah,
Crusades, in the
that's true too.
cross-cultural influences for coming from other places. But as we've talked about many times, Stephen, I mean, the art of the Middle Ages was brilliant and
Hmm.
beautiful. I mean,
It was.
there's nothing about a medieval cathedral that is backwards compared to a later church. You know,
Absolutely.
incredibly beautiful, and very, very high workmanship and quality of architecture. And as I say, in sewage systems, and hot and cold running water for the wealthy. I know it didn't go down all the way down, but it wasn't that they couldn't provide it or they didn't value sanitation and cleanliness.
All right.
But
Well,
I think we're
everybody.
talking to the converted on this group.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was great, Helena. I appreciate you being here with me, and everybody, thanks for stopping by.
Yes, thanks everybody for taking such an interest and taking time and talking to us. And I hope we have answered some of your questions and have helped you to know where to look and find more. As I say, read Piers Mitchell's book on medical care if that's something you're interested. Go into the history of the Hospitallers. It's fascinating. It's a wonderful history, and find out more about those early hospitals. We're just sort of a spokesman. Both J. Stephen and I are tertiary historians, as say. We're basically quoting the other experts that have already done the really difficult research and the primary research. So if you're interested in this, please go and find those books. And we've got the picture of my book. I've got an extensive bibliography in it. I do cite my sources. It's a good place to start, because from there you can go and follow my roots, follow my sources back, and find out more. I urge you all to do that.
Absolutely, guys. Do check out Helena's awesome book about the Crusader States, the Holy Land in the era of the Crusades. That is a really good place to get a good overview of the history of the Crusader States. I actually have a link for it down below in the stream, as I always do when we have Helena on, so you guys can check that out. And so I stay tuned, guys, to this channel. I mean, we will come up with some future live projects, and we will make it happen. I certainly promise you that. This every Tuesday thing, I think I'm going to suspend for now, but just to kind of like get a little bit more productive with the YouTube channel videos. So, but we will, we'll do some live stuff. I think probably a good thing to do at some point will be to get Rand and Helena and Scott and everybody together for just a little for a good old fashioned Real Crusades history topical stream, or maybe a series on something. So come up with some ideas and email them to us. And
I was going to say, or if you guys have questions, we could maybe, I'm talking out of turn, J. Stephen, but if they send the questions, if you collect questions, if people send you questions, we might be able to see where there are clusters of interest. So if there's a big cluster around, as you say, the Third Crusade, or there's a big cluster around medicine, or there's a big cluster around relations with Byzantium or whatever, we could maybe, knowing where those questions, where that cluster of interest is, then fashion a show that addresses those topics.
Definitely. Yeah, we will be doing some of that in the not too distant future. I have no doubt about that. So yeah, guys, feel free to email me at realcrusadeshistory@gmail.com. Just all one phrase there, realcrusadeshistory@gmail.com. That's always the best place to get a hold of me. And you can send topics there. People are all asking in the chat, where do we send emails? So perfect. So that's the way to do it. And come up with some ideas for stream series for us, because we've done some really cool stuff in the past. We did the First Crusade, we did the Third Crusade. That's kind of like one of my favorites. That was years ago that we did with Helena and Dr. Donachie, and we did the Fourth Crusade at one point. We did. We've done a ton of really fun stuff, and we're gonna keep doing that in the future. So. All right, Helena, it was a pleasure. Thanks for being with me on some of these Tuesday streams.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you very much. Bye to everybody.
All right. Bye, guys.
For now.